Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole van der Meulen. I'm Cybersecurity Innovation Lead at SURF. Thankfully to Helma and for everyone who was here this morning, I don't have to explain what SURF is, but for those of you who weren't here, I'll keep it very brief. SURF is the ICT cooperation for a variety of organizations, including universities, applied universities, and vocational schools. But in fact, I'm going to go back all the way to the start of my career, which was in 2006. I feel like this is not moving. Yes. Perfect. So 18 years ago, yes, you can calculate how old I am. Please be my guest. It was, in fact, my birthday yesterday. I have turned a big 4-0. Thank you. So in 2006, I was, in fact, 21, very young, very optimistic and naive. Slightly less naive at the moment and far more cynical, but let's stay with 2006. I started a PhD research project on identity theft. This was going to lead to a new type of victim, so specifically digital identity theft. The thing is, I started this full of optimism. I started speaking to people about this, and most of them said, no, this isn't going to be a problem in the Netherlands. That's just an American thing. We are different. Yeah. So I became extremely discouraged. This was me. I know you've seen this before this morning because Helma inspired many of the cat pictures. So I was discouraged and I thought, what am I going to do now? But the thing is, for anyone who's done a PhD, it's like starting antibiotics. You have to finish. You cannot stop midway. So I basically started doing a comparative study. So if people say this is not going to be a problem in the Netherlands, let's look at why it is a problem in the United States and how we are different. And then this man came along, thankfully, in 2008. And in a way, I say thankfully for my research and my point, but it was, of course, very sad for him, because he was the first public victim of identity theft in the Netherlands. His name is Ron Causolea. His case was taken up by the National Ombudsman, and it received a lot of attention, because basically someone had misused his personal information for a variety of reasons. And he tried to indicate this several times, that he was, in fact, not the one who did it, that he was the victim. The problem is, and this is really the essential part of being a victim of identity theft and what concerns me the most looking ahead with regard to voice cloning and deepfakes, is that how do you prove something you didn't do? Every criminal always says, I didn't do it. So no one is really inclined to believe you. There is a reverse burden of proof. And the thing is, there is this belief that the system is never wrong. So there is, whatever is in the database is correct. That's this assumption of authenticity. And that's what Ron Causolea ran into, and that is what many victims of identity theft run into. But there is no absolute security. I think we can agree on that. So there is no absolute authenticity. We have to keep an open mind that something in the system could in fact be false, incorrect, or misentered. So I'm going to fast forward to 2020. Older, like I said, more cynical, less naive. I was working for Europol, the European Cybercrime Center, and I was leading the IOCTA, so the Internet Organized Crime Threat Assessment. And what we tried to do there is basically look at the threat landscape and how it changes from year to year, but at a strategic level. So that's very important. So people say, oh, cybercrime moves so fast. At an operational level, yes. But at a strategic level, it's far slower. So in fact, when I did the IOCTA in 2020, which was, of course, the COVID year, I did all these interviews remote with law enforcement officials in all the EU countries. And we came to the conclusion together with the project team that cybercrime is an evolution rather than a revolution. So change happens incrementally. And finally, I came to a conclusion that where we are now, there is no such thing as a new threat. I believe that everything we see now is something we've seen before, but adapted and changed. And the reason why this is important is that I don't know how it is for you, but at least back in the day when I was still working for Europol up until end of 2022, especially the communications department kept asking me, so what is new this year? Because we cannot report on ransomware again. Well, that is reality. This was said to me in 2019, and in 2024, ransomware is still the main thing. But changes do occur. Criminals adapt when necessary. So if we introduce security measures, that means some of their modus operandi or some of their tactics don't work anymore, they will adapt, obviously. And they will adapt when an opportunity arises. So obviously when new technology enters the scene, but also when something changes in society, because they will always adapt their narrative to what makes it believable and credible to enhance the success of their attacks. But they do not disobey their roots, and I cannot emphasize this enough. And the reason I want to emphasize this, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, usually I have a different audience, is that based on their general tactics, we should be able to anticipate what will happen next. That doesn't mean we can prevent it, but it does mean we should take into consideration that this can happen, and what do we do when it happens? And I say we, but I mean this in terms of not the general public, but government agencies, different private companies, etc., etc. So in terms of general tactics, I think it's well known. Obviously, there is always creating this false sense of urgency, pushing someone into a heightened emotional state, and really trying to get them to a point where they behave in a way they may not behave under normal circumstances. So this is very much focusing on the scam context more than the identity theft context. So if we take all of this into consideration, does generative AI present a new threat? Most people, at least the hypers, I would say, would like to say yes. And there's many companies who would like you to believe that yes, it presents a new threat. I used to say no. Now I'm a bit on the fence. But I would still say no, but. Criminals use, when it comes to large language models, criminals mostly use them to refine their methods. So, for malicious software, malicious tools, to expedite the process, to make them more effective, and of course, for social engineering techniques, which is the focus here. And obviously, anything that becomes part of cybercrime also subsequently becomes part of cybercrime as a service. So it will be found anywhere on the dark web or on Telegram. So we've already seen the barrier to enter the cybercrime scene lower over the years. It will just continue to lower further. So in general, Gen AI makes things easier and more efficient, but it also introduces capabilities we have not really witnessed before, at least at a level we have not witnessed before. And I think this is the key to what I'm trying to say today. So when it comes to identity, there's different forms of authentication. Obviously, we all talk about multi-factor. Most focus, I would say, when it comes to compromise and when it comes to public awareness is always on something we know and to a lesser extent on something we have. It's always about keep your information safe, protect your username and password. So all things that we know. We have is more about the devices generally. I would say it's far less about something we are, because that is more challenging to compromise, and it requires more resources and time on the criminal's end. The introduction of digital twins, or what is better known as deepfakes, and voice cloning does change the situation. From my perspective, it makes something we are vulnerable, and it makes me very concerned, going back to my historical research and my historical knowledge when it comes to identity theft. And the interesting thing is, I don't know how many of you know Catfish. Yeah, just a few. Okay, good, good. So Catfish used to be a show on MTV. Maybe it still is. I don't watch it anymore. And it was always about people who started an online relationship. And when they wanted the other person to appear in front of the camera, that person would always have an excuse not to. Oh, my camera isn't working. My computer's broken. I'm not alone. There was always a reason. So this was a red flag for people, because why didn't this person just appear in front of the camera? And the thing is, then these two guys who ran the show would try to find this person, meet this person, and I would say most of the time it was someone else. So it was someone who claimed to be another person. We don't have this anymore, because obviously now anyone can be anyone in front of the camera. So this red flag, this feeling of intuition is basically gone. So what are we talking about? We're not just speaking about identity theft as I researched it before. There's obviously many different types of impersonation fraud. There is pretending to be a different person towards an organization, pretending to be a specific employee. Obviously, we're all familiar, I hope, with CEO fraud. And pretending to be an organization towards an individual, which is obviously what most phishing emails are based on. Pretending to be someone else in general. And, of course, with the ability of digital twins, we can also create synthetic identities, which is a slightly different impact in terms of victimization, I would say, depending on who they're acting towards. But the main difference is, on the one hand, we have a category where you can be misled by a criminal. So you're the victim of a scam. I'll go into a number of examples after this. But you can also be part of the attack. And this is what concerns me more. So that someone takes your identity to mislead another person or to pretend to be you towards an organization. So it could be to drain an existing account, but it could also be to set up a new account. And when that happens, you will not be aware until the damage has gone too far, most likely. And then you have to sort of unravel it, which is why there's often this example, or this parallel, I should say, with identity theft and sort of Kafka's The Trial, where you don't know what happened, but you're being accused of something. Sometimes you can't even get the information. So I understand these are nightmare scenarios. They're very exceptional, but even the exceptions we have to bear in mind. Either way, you're a victim, and I think that's most important, and you need to be treated as such. I'm not a huge fan of sort of spreading around numbers or statistics, but I think the Federal Trade Commission, which is active in the United States, creates its statistics and its numbers based on actual complaints. And I think it's an indication of the fact of how many people fall victim, but also what the financial burden is. So what type of examples are we actually talking about? I've included a few in this presentation to make it more concrete, and it's also to see what kind of varieties we witness. Jaya mentioned this example yesterday with the employee in Hong Kong actually falling victim to a deepfake as part of a CFO fraud. The interesting thing is this actually happened in February earlier this year, but it has returned in the media because they discovered it was a UK firm. But it's not that recent as she indicated, but it is probably the most profound example because people were warning for this a long time. I'm not saying it didn't happen before, but this is the one that sort of broke into the scene, and it's also for a significant amount of money. But being closer to home, I advise everyone to read this narrative, which is in the New Yorker, and that is actually about someone being called in the middle of the night by someone pretending to be his mother, or actually the wife's mother, I believe. And in the mother's voice, this person said, "I've been taken hostage. They want money in order to let me go." So as you can imagine, how can you not feel a sense of urgency and feel a sense of panic when someone calls you in the middle of the night saying that, especially when it's the voice of your mother? Obviously, as they discovered later on, when they had transferred money, the situation was resolved, and they called back to call the father. The father said, "Your mother's sound asleep." But in that moment, they didn't have time to reason or even explore the possibility that this was not real. So there's a lot of situations going on that I think hit much closer to home. We've seen WhatsApp fraud before where someone pretends to be your brother, your daughter, any type of family member saying, "I've lost my phone, I need help, can you please transfer money?" So we've already witnessed that. But with the ability to clone voices, it obviously gets that extra layer. It makes it more credible. If on top of that they spoof your number. And I think this is something that we will unfortunately potentially encounter at any time. Then there is, I already mentioned romance scams when I mentioned catfish. I'm sure many of you are aware of pig butchering, which is a combination of investment scams and romance scams. So someone starts, speaking to you online, a relationship evolves, then says, "I've been investing in crypto and I've been super successful and I think you should invest too." And this happens a lot for a significant amount of money, different target, different victims. I think it's a myth that it has anything to do with intelligence level. I also find it a bit offensive when people say that. And the thing is that what we witness is, because this article specifically mentions the Yahoo boys go back all the way to the Nigerian prince scam. So what you also see is that the criminals, like I said, they just evolve along with the different technological developments. And now there is no more barriers to appear in front of the camera and appear to be anyone in real time, which is what is happening. And then there's this, which actually comes to the point of identity theft, except it doesn't have the consequences I've mentioned at the start, but it is a fascinating case in the sense that this is happening more frequently now. So KnowBe4 was the first company, I believe, to come out with this. There are basically fake North Korean IT workers. So people apply for jobs, mostly at American companies, but it could be at other companies as well, and go through the entire process. This one even had 4 video conference-based interviews. There was background checks, there was screening, but this person used an existing American identity. So he passed through all the screenings, all the background checks, used technology basically to appear as though he was this person, was hired, received all of his materials in the US, but was able to connect remotely. And then KnowBe4 realized that malware was being downloaded on these devices. So that's when they fired him. But the interesting thing is, even though this first came out, at least into the broad public, into the media in 2024, US authorities were already warning in 2022, in 2023, and in 2024 they actually filed charges and seizures were brought. And here they indicated it happened to more than 300 companies. Now, in this case, of course, the companies are, in fact, the victims. But I'm also starting to wonder what will happen to the people whose identity have been abused. And, of course, North Koreans like to take it a step further because they primarily, as with any criminal, even though they're a state, they're operating like a criminal in that sense, they're trying to gain more and more financial profit. So this was at another firm. The company didn't think the person was performing, another fake North Korean IT worker. And basically, they fired him. And then he started extorting them. Because why wouldn't you, mix up the tactics? And then one of the final examples, again, on a more personal level, because I think it's important that when we talk about these things, we do not just speak about sort of the companies that fall victim, but also the actual people, how it's used in sort of more individual lives, basically. And in this scenario, this was a principal at an American high school, and his voice had been cloned by a disgruntled colleague. And in this voice, he had supposedly said racist slurs. The problem is, it sounds like him. So people assumed it was authentic and immediately, started obviously targeting him. He said, this is not me. This sounds like me, but I did not say this. Again, reverse burden of proof. And thankfully, in his case, law enforcement was able to assist him in terms of investigating the case, identifying the actual culprit. And in that sense, it came out that it was indeed not him. But in order for it to come that far, someone has to believe you. In order for someone to start an investigation or look into the situation, someone actually has to believe you. And this is just a final example in terms of what's already out there. Jaya yesterday mentioned generative 3.0. There's also deepfakes with stolen IDs. So there's a lot of possibilities that are already available from a crime as a service perspective. So we have identity theft, which is already sort of a Kafkaesque nightmare. And AI is just an added element, making it far more complicated. And I feel like, especially when it comes to the element of identity theft, there's very little attention. When it comes to deepfake, there's a lot of attention, and I'm not criticizing that, I'm just observing, for deepfake pornography, deepfake politicians, and I understand that, but there's many more situations in which it can affect our lives. So what is our response? Well, of course, the first response is, it's a technological problem, so we're going to use technology to respond to it. And this already started several years ago, when the Defense Department was already onto it and started creating the first tools. And I think this is what the primary focus is on. But as someone said on Vice, there is no tech solution. In essence, as we all know, it will become an arms race. And there is a much more fundamental problem that I'll get to in a moment that we have to deal with. Then, of course, there's the element of policy. One potential, at least I would definitely never would call a solution, but at least one element is to say, okay, we're going to outlaw it, we're going to criminalize it. I don't think there's any harm in that, but I don't think it's going to do much for the problem in terms of, and that's also what we saw this morning with Helma. Yes, law enforcement has a capacity problem. They might be sometimes successful in disrupting parts of the infrastructure, but what comes down immediately comes back up. And in terms of actually identifying suspects and subsequently prosecuting them, I would say percentage-wise, it's extremely disappointing. So there's nothing wrong with this, but don't introduce it as a potential solution. And what I find really interesting is when people talk about policy and technology, it's always like, oh, it goes too fast, we can't keep up with it. And it's really interesting, because I just came across this, in fact, last night, and then I thought, 2021. So in 2021, the Rathenau Institute already did a study for the European Parliament on options within European policy. So that's a good 3 years ago. Yes, technology moves fast, but you've been talking about this 3 years ago. And in fact, this article is from 2019. So it's not as if we didn't see it coming. So I don't buy this claim of it's going too fast. I would understand that you say we're not entirely sure how to respond to it. And again, going back to what Jaya said yesterday, it is a shared responsibility. So it's also about holding the companies who are actually introducing the software responsible. And that doesn't seem to be happening as much. And then, of course, there's public awareness. And this is like the teddy bear of solutions, because like nobody can be against public awareness. I sometimes am, but I'll get to that in a moment. How relevant is public awareness, though, when you focus on trying to teach people to detect deepfakes and trying to teach them how to recognize a voice clone? I don't believe that's very reasonable to expect from people, and it's also very temporary, because in that sense, technology does improve. So this is from 2021, where they already said we have difficulty sort of distinguishing and identifying. This is more recent from the Dutch government in terms of to what extent are we able to identify a voice clone. So I don't think this is what we should teach people as a way of public awareness. I think we should try to help people understand what I showed all the way in the beginning, and that's more focused on general tactics. So what will criminals try to get you to do? They will try to get you in an emotional state, give you a false sense of urgency, and they will almost always try to get you to transfer money. That should be the biggest red flag. Like I said, I've been critical of public awareness already from the start of my career, and that's predominantly because I feel like there is this notion of we're making people aware, and that makes them able to defend themselves. I don't think that's true, and I also think we shouldn't have that expectation. I think people will try their hardest, but if you give them only sort of signals on a website or signals of a deepfake to look at, if they think, okay, you know, for example, people say, oh, look at that, it doesn't have 6 fingers. If there's a deepfake and somebody only has 5 fingers on one hand, they'll say, well, we checked for that. But so I want people to sort of more critically think of how they can potentially become a victim. And then the final one is this idea of having a zero trust mindset. I think this is a bit worrisome, because I would like there to still be trust. But I do think we have to move away from the absolute assumption that everything is authentic, which is what is happening a lot now. Considering the amount of content that is created, considering the capabilities with regard to deepfake and voice cloning, we have to at least assume something could be inauthentic until proven otherwise. And that brings me to sort of coming close to the conclusion, and that is that sometimes we have to use other means to verify who we're speaking to. So this is an example where someone was able to successfully identify a fake by asking some questions. And one of the other suggestions that's given, this is from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, for example, in family situations, is to have a family password. It's not bulletproof, but nothing is. But if you only share it in a physical situation, it could be a way to go as a risk management tool. There are also people doing this at companies. Of course, then, at some point you have to change it. But I think it's still I would say, a more promising approach than some of the other things people are recommending. Still, if we look ahead, I think one of the most difficult questions we have to answer, which I don't have an answer to, but I would very much hope that it becomes much more of a debate, of a discussion, is considering everything that is possible, how do we prove who we are in the future? And on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Did you ever encounter it yourself?
No, so the interesting thing is I've not encountered any deepfake or voice clones, as far as I know.
As far as you know. Are you real right now?
Yeah. But the interesting thing is, as soon as somebody asks you for money, I'm suspicious.
Yeah, it's done. That's good. And the last picture was very good. I will share that with the kids. That's good. Are there any questions in the room? We have time for some questions. There it is.
Yes, well, as a hardware engineer, usually I look at physical unclonable functions. And if you authenticate humans, that will be probably some biometric identity. We should protect that, right?
You mean biometric identity, like
yes,
fingerprints,
exactly.
facial scan?
Yes, or iris scans and that kind of...
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You said we should protect it. Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Other questions?
I almost thought it was a trick question, so that's why I had to verify.
Okay. No, well, thank you very much. Thank you so much.